It's July 30th, 2026, and while most of the world was asleep, CENTCOM just confirmed something that changes the entire shape of this war. At 8:00 p.m. Eastern, last night, U.S. forces began launching what officials are calling a heavy wave of strikes against Iran, hitting Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets across the south of the country. Explosions were reported over Bandar Abbas, Kish Island, and Keshm, all critical maritime choke points sitting right on the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. And buried inside the briefing notes on why this happened is the number everybody should be paying attention to right now: 5,000 kilometers. That's the range American and Israeli defense officials now believe Iran's newest missile family can actually fly. Not the 2,000 kilometers Tehran has spent years swearing to publicly. Not even the 4,000 kilometers that got confirmed a few months back. 5,000. And then, less than 24 hours after that number started circulating in defense briefings, this happened. So let's break down exactly what triggered last night's strikes, why this missile threat is a completely different animal than anything Iran has fielded before, and why what happens next in the Gulf could reshape how the entire world thinks about missile defense. Here's how we got to last night. 2 days ago, Iran launched a wave of ballistic missiles at American forces stationed across the Middle East. CENTCOM says every single one of those missiles was intercepted. Nobody got hurt on the American side. But President Trump made it very clear, sitting in the Oval Office after meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister, that interception wasn't going to be the end of the story. He told reporters Iran was going to get a beating. Well, in less than 48 hours later, that's exactly what happened. CENTCOM says the retaliatory strikes hit military command centers, missile and drone production facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capability along Iran's southern coast. The stated goal, in their words, was to further diminish the threats Iran and its proxies pose to American troops, commercial shipping, and Gulf neighbors. Straightforward enough. But here's the part that should actually worry you, and it's not the strikes themselves. It's the reason those interceptions almost didn't happen the way they were supposed to. Because for months now, there's been a quiet argument going on inside defense circles about whether Iran's missile program has been lying to the entire world about what it can actually do. Iran's own foreign minister went on NBC back in March and said, on camera, "We have intentionally kept the range of our missiles below 2,000 kilometers." That's the official line. That's what Tehran has told the UN, told inspectors, told everybody for years. Self-imposed restraint, they call it. Very responsible of them. Except then, in late March, missiles started flying toward Diego Garcia. If you don't know Diego Garcia, it's a joint US-UK base sitting way out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, roughly 3,800 kilometers from the nearest point of Iranian territory. That's not a rounding error. That's nearly double what Iran claims its missiles can do. The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed the launch. The UK's own Secretary of State for Defense confirmed it separately. And by the end of April, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth was sitting in front of a Senate committee saying, and I'm going to get this close to word for word because it matters, I saw a 4,000 kilometer range missile being shot at Diego Garcia. That's not an estimate from an intelligence report gathering dust somewhere. That's the man running the Department of War telling elected officials, on the record, that Iran has already demonstrated double the range it claims to have. So when Iran's foreign minister says 2,000 kilometers with a straight face, either he doesn't know what his own military is building, or he's lying. And if you followed this regime for more than 5 minutes, you already know which one it is. Now here's where the 5,000 kilometer number comes in. And this is the part that turns a bad situation into a genuinely alarming one. Iran has a satellite launch vehicle called the Zoljana. On paper, it's a space program tool, something you'd use to put a small payload into orbit. Very peaceful, very scientific, nothing to see here. Except missile analysts have looked at the physics of that rocket and concluded that if you strip out the satellite hardware and swap in a 1-ton warhead instead, you get a ballistic missile capable of flying 5,000 kilometers. Israel's ambassador to the UN put that assessment in writing in a formal letter to the Security Council, laying out exactly why a supposedly civilian space launcher lines up almost perfectly with a weapons platform. And here's the detail that should make your stomach turn a little. 5,000 kilometers doesn't just mean it can hit Israel or Diego Garcia or every American base scattered across the Gulf. It means it can reach every country in Europe, every single one, including Iceland, sitting way up in the North Atlantic. Think about what that actually means for a second. This isn't a regional threat anymore if that capability is real and fielded. This is a missile that turns Iran from a country that can threaten its neighbors into a country that can theoretically threaten a continent. And Iran's response to Israel's letter was exactly what you'd expect. Their ambassador wrote back, insisting the space program is purely peaceful. Sure it is. Just like the nuclear program was purely peaceful, right up until we found out otherwise. Just like Sharif University was purely academic right up until we found out it was designing missile guidance systems. There's a pattern here, and it's not a subtle one. So let's talk about why this keeps happening, why Iran keeps quietly walking its missile ranges further and further past what it publicly admits to. Because it's not one rogue missile program doing this by accident. It's a deliberate design philosophy that's been building for years. Go back to the Khorramshahr family. Iran first unveiled a version of it back in 2017 with a declared range of 2,000 kilometers, capable of carrying multiple warheads on a single missile. European intelligence services looked at the actual physical dimensions of that missile's nose cone in 2019 and concluded the real warhead mass had to be smaller than Iran claimed, which meant the real range had to be bigger. Their math put it closer to 3,000 kilometers, not 2. Then, in 2023, Iran unveiled the next generation, the Khorramshahr 4, also known as the K-bar. Officially, still capped around 2,000 kilometers. Independent estimates put the real ceiling as high as 4,000. That missile got fully deployed earlier this year, and now we're staring at a 5th generation, built off a supposedly civilian rocket that pushes the real number to 5,000. You see the shape of it now. Every single time, the public number stays conveniently low, and every single time, the real capability creeps higher. That's not restraint. That's a regime that understood exactly how much rope the international community would give them if they kept saying the right words in press conferences while quietly building something completely different in underground facilities. And that underground part matters more than people realize. Because this war has been going on since February, when a coordinated set of US and Israeli strikes took out Iran's supreme leader and triggered everything that's followed. Iran responded by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. The US responded with a full naval blockade that's reportedly already cost Iran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue. By any reasonable measure, Iran's conventional military has been getting hammered for months. Its navy is a shadow of what it was. Its air defense network has taken repeated hits. And yet, according to recent reporting, Iran has already restored more than half of its pre-war missile production capacity, almost entirely by running that manufacturing underground, out of reach of the bombs. That's the terrorist proxy playbook that people who've actually studied this regime for years will tell you was always coming. You take out their surface capability, and they burrow. You degrade their navy, and they lean harder on missiles they can build in tunnels nobody can see into from satellite imagery. And on top of the range problem, those missiles have reportedly been redesigned to travel at higher speeds and maneuver during their descent, specifically to make them harder for American interceptor systems to track and destroy. That's a direct answer to Patriot and THAAD, the two systems America relies on most heavily to knock these things down before they hit anything. When a missile can juke on the way in instead of flying a predictable straight line, every intercept gets exponentially harder, and everyone that gets through does so because the physics of missile defense are simply less forgiving than the physics of missile offense. Which brings us to why last night's retaliation looked the way it did. If you're a battlefield commander looking at an adversary that's rebuilding capacity faster than expected, extending range further than declared, and making its missiles harder to shoot down, you don't wait around. You go after the production and command infrastructure directly, which is exactly what CENTCOM says it did. Military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites. Not just the missiles sitting on launchers, the factories and the brains behind them. That's the same logic we saw play out earlier this year when strikes went after facilities like the Pars Energy Complex, which was directly powering the ballistic missile program, and the technical centers, where the actual guidance systems for these weapons get designed. You don't just swat down the arrow, you go after the people making the bow. And if you've been following this channel or any serious defense reporting through this war, you already know that's been the consistent doctrine from day one. Take out command and control first, take out production capability second, save the population centers and the highest value symbolic targets like Tehran itself as the last resort, the thing you dangle in front of the regime to try to force real behavioral change instead of another round of hollow diplomatic promises. Now, before we go further, I want to pause on something, because if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what part of this you want unpacked further, because there's a lot more layers to get into here, and the comment section genuinely shapes what I dig into next. Also, if you're not subscribed yet and you want to keep getting these updates as this war keeps evolving, because it is evolving fast, now's a good time to do that so you don't miss the next one. All right, back to it. Because the missile threat isn't the only front that opened up in the last few days. This war just widened in a way it hadn't before. Saudi Arabia, which has spent months trying very hard to stay out of direct involvement, finally struck Iranian-backed proxy targets inside Iraq. That's a significant shift. Riyadh has been walking an extremely careful line since this war started, publicly calling for de-escalation while privately absorbing enormous economic pressure from disrupted shipping lanes and spiking insurance costs on every tanker moving through the region. The fact that they finally pulled the trigger on direct strikes tells you something about how much patience has run out across the Gulf. And Iraq's response was immediate outrage, with the Iraqi prime minister directing his foreign ministry to pursue legal action against both the United States and Saudi Arabia over casualties from those strikes. So now you've got a fourth and fifth country getting actively pulled deeper into direct military action in a war that started as a two-party fight between the US, Israel, and Iran. That's how regional conflicts metastasize. Nobody plans to widen a war. It just keeps happening one retaliatory strike at a time until you look up and half the region is involved. And then there's Jordan, which took a direct hit just last week when Iran struck the Muwafaq Salti Air Base, an installation that hosts a significant number of U.S. aircraft and sits only about 100 kilometers from Israel. 2 American troops were killed in that strike, with a third reported missing. That was the fourth attack in 5 days at that point. And it's exactly the kind of strategic targeting you'd expect from a country trying to weaken the broader regional air defense network piece by piece, rather than going straight at Israel or straight at the continental United States, neither of which it can currently reach with confidence. Jordan intercepted 5 missiles during a follow-up Iranian attack days later, successfully engaging every incoming target according to their armed forces. Good defense work, but every successful intercept still costs interceptor missiles that need replacing, still costs radar time, still costs a country that isn't even a primary combatant real resources it wasn't planning to spend this year. Now, let's talk economics for a second, because war doesn't just cost lives and hardware, it costs everybody at the gas pump too. Brent crude jumped over 7% in a single day this week, crossing $90 a barrel after Trump's threats of retaliation started circulating. That's the kind of single-day spike that makes commodity traders lose sleep. And it's not just the direct strikes causing it. Iran-backed Houthi forces have separately declared that Saudi ships attempting to reach the Indian Ocean will be considered targets, which has already caused transits through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait to drop by more than 20%, with Strait of Hormuz traffic sitting at historically low levels too. The shipping industry is actively exploring alternate routes, including pushing more traffic through the Suez Canal, just to avoid 2 of the most dangerous waterways on the planet right now. So every time you fill up your car over the next few weeks, you're feeling a small ripple effect of missiles flying 6,000 miles away. That's how connected this all is, whether people want to admit it or not. Let's go back to the hardware for a minute, because I think people underestimate just how much of a technical arms race is happening beneath all the headline strikes. Iran isn't just working on offense. They're patching their defense too. Reports this week indicate Iran is about to receive an initial shipment of somewhere between 300 and 400 Chinese-made man-portable air defense systems, the QW-12 and FN-16 models specifically. These are shoulder-fired, infrared-guided missiles designed to take down low-flying aircraft, cruise missiles, and drones. The deal is valued somewhere between $60 and $70 million, which works out to somewhere around $150,000 to $230,000 per launcher kit once you factor in training equipment and spare parts. Why does this matter? Because Iran's static, fixed air defense sites have gotten torn apart repeatedly throughout this war. Mobile, shoulder-fired systems that can be dispersed across missile bases and nuclear facilities are a lot harder to identify and destroy from the air, compared to a big radar installation sitting in one place. This is Iran adapting in real time, trying to build a layered, low-altitude defense screen out of thousands of small, mobile, hard-to-target pieces, instead of a handful of easy-to-hit big ones. It's a smart move on paper. It's also a direct signal that Beijing is willing to keep quietly arming this regime even as the rest of the world watches the death toll climb, which tells you exactly where China's actual loyalties sit in this conflict, regardless of what their diplomats say in front of cameras about neutrality and de-escalation. And speaking of civilian cost, because this conversation can't just be missile ranges and strike packages without acknowledging the human toll underneath it, there was a U.S. strike back in February on a school in Manab that killed 168 children and 14 adults. A Democratic congresswoman called it a national shame and a war crime just this week, pointing out that the government investigation into what happened has apparently been sitting stalled inside a military command for months without resolution. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that number doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. And any honest accounting of this war has to hold both truths at once. Iran is a regime that funds terror proxies across the region, executes its own protesters, and has spent years lying about its weapons programs to the entire international community. And also, war is never clean, and civilians on both sides are paying a price that political leadership on every side of this conflict doesn't have to personally absorb. You can support decisive action against a regime that's proven itself willing to strike hospitals, kill mariners in international waters, and execute teenagers after 1-hour show trials, while still demanding real accountability when the response causes mass civilian casualties. Those two positions aren't contradictory. They're just honest. Which brings me to the piece I think most coverage of this conflict keeps missing entirely. So let's do the strategic breakdown here. Iran's stated public goal throughout this entire war has been straightforward: reassert control over the Strait of Hormuz and force sanctions relief through negotiation. But look at what they're actually doing instead of what they're saying. They're not negotiating from a position of strength, no matter how loud the state television rhetoric gets. They're a regime that has to execute its own protesters, just to hold the streets at home while simultaneously getting hammered by strikes on their own soil almost nightly. That's not the profile of a confident government calmly managing a conflict from a position of leverage. That's the profile of a regime trying to look like it's winning domestically, while it's actually losing on nearly every front that matters strategically. The missile range escalation fits that exact pattern too. When you can't win with your Navy, and you can't win with your Air Force, and you can't win with a ground invasion because you don't even share a land border with most of the countries you're threatening, what's left? You reach for the one card that still generates fear, regardless of your conventional military standing: a weapon that can theoretically hit farther than anyone previously believed possible. It's a deterrence play dressed up as a capability announcement. Whether the 5,000 kilometer number represents a fully operational combat-ready weapon system right now, or whether it's still more theoretical than proven, honestly matters less than the psychological effect it's designed to produce. Iran wants Washington, Tel Aviv, and every capital across Europe to start factoring what if they can actually reach us now into every single policy decision going forward. That uncertainty itself is the weapon, sometimes even more than the missile is. Now, does that mean the threat should be dismissed as pure theater? Absolutely not, and here's why. Because even a partially successful missile program with real 5,000 kilometer reach doesn't need to hit its target every single time to change the strategic calculus. It just needs to be credible enough that adversaries have to plan around the worst case scenario instead of the most likely one. That's how deterrence has worked for as long as ballistic weapons have existed. You don't need 100% reliability. You need enough uncertainty that nobody's willing to bet an entire city on being wrong. And that's exactly why last night's strikes targeted production facilities and command infrastructure instead of waiting to see if the threat materializes into something undeniable first. The doctrine here is preventive, not reactive. Hit the capability before it fully matures, not after. So where does this actually go from here? A few things to watch closely over the coming days. First, watch whether Iran attempts any kind of retaliatory strike, specifically aimed at proving that extended range capability in a live combat scenario, rather than just in intelligence assessments and diplomatic letters to the UN. If they want the deterrent value of that 5,000 kilometer number, at some point they may feel pressure to actually demonstrate it beyond just a satellite launch vehicle estimate. The same way the Diego Garcia strike demonstrated the 4,000 kilometer capability earlier this year. Second, watch how European governments respond diplomatically once this range assessment gets more formal confirmation, because a continent that has largely treated this as a Middle Eastern regional conflict up to this point may suddenly have a very different, much more personal set of incentives to get more directly involved in pushing for resolution once the map of who's theoretically in range expands to include their own capitals. Third, keep an eye on how Saudi Arabia's entry into direct strikes evolves, because if Riyadh keeps escalating its own involvement, this stops being a US-Israel-Iran conflict with occasional regional spillover and starts becoming something that looks a lot more like a genuinely multilateral regional war, which is a completely different and much harder problem to eventually walk back from the negotiating table. And honestly, that's the part that should concern anyone watching this closely, regardless of which side of the political spectrum you're sitting on. Wars have a way of widening faster than anyone intends, and narrowing much, much slower than anyone hopes. Every new country that gets pulled in, whether it's Jordan taking missile fire, Saudi Arabia striking proxies in Iraq, or the shipping industry rerouting around two different straits simultaneously, adds another set of interests, another set of grievances, and another set of political pressures that eventually need resolving before this thing actually ends. The 5,000 kilometer missile isn't just a technical specification buried in an intelligence report. It's a symbol of exactly how much this conflict has grown since February, from a targeted strike on a single individual to a sprawling, multi-country conflict with global economic ripple effects, and a weapons threat that, if the assessments hold up, now reaches an entire continent that wasn't part of the original equation at all. So here's what I want to know from you, and I genuinely mean this. Drop it in the comments below. Do you think Iran's public 2,000 kilometer claim was ever remotely honest? Or do you think this regime has been quietly building toward exactly this moment the entire time, using compliance rhetoric as cover? And where do you think this war realistically ends? Does it end with a negotiated settlement that actually holds this time? Or does it keep widening until we're looking at a conflict that spans half the region with no clean off-ramp left for anybody involved? I want to hear your write on it. because these situations develop fast, and the more perspectives sitting in that comment section, the better this community gets at spotting the next move before it happens. And if this kind of detailed, no-spin breakdown is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed and sharing this with anyone who's been struggling to keep up with how fast this conflict has been moving. Because between the missile escalation, the widening list of countries getting pulled in, and the economic pressure building on oil markets and shipping routes, this is genuinely one of the fastest moving conflicts we've tracked in years, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.